For almost all of human history, the most expensive bread you could buy was white. It wasn't a matter of taste, it was a matter of power. White flour demanded more work, more milling, more sifting. Separating the bran and the germ from the pale, soft endosperm cost time, and time cost money. The result was a light, soft, almost luminous loaf that the rich served at their tables while the poor chewed something dark, dense, and irregular. You looked at someone's bread and you knew exactly who that person was. White bread was wealth. Dark bread was survival. Today, that order is completely reversed. A loaf of industrial sliced white bread wrapped in plastic, available at any corner store, costs less than $2. A sourdough boule made with whole wheat flour by a baker who woke up at 4 in the morning to feed the live starter he's been cultivating for 2 years can cost $15. The dark, dense, complex bread is now the expensive one. The rich eat whole grain, the poor eat white bread. This inversion happened in less than 100 years, and it was so complete that most people alive today remember nothing of the world it replaced. This is the story of how a single food crossed 14,000 years, toppled empires, started revolutions, and still says more about who you are than almost anything else you put in your mouth. Bread was born from a mistake. About 14,000 years ago, someone left a wet paste of wild grain exposed to the air for too long. When they came back, they found something different from what they had left. The dough had risen. Tiny bubbles had formed inside. The smell was different. Nobody planned any of it. No scientist formulated a hypothesis. What happened was that wild yeasts living in the air colonized the mixture, consumed the sugars, and released carbon dioxide. The gas bubbles got trapped inside the gluten network formed when the grain's proteins came into contact with water. The dough swelled. When baked, it held its shape. It was bread, and nobody had invented anything. The oldest physical evidence of bread making was discovered in 2018 at an archaeological site in northeastern Jordan. It is 14,400 years old. The Natufians who lived there were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers. They had not yet completed the transition to organized agriculture. They ground wild grains, mixed them with water, and baked flatbreads on heated stones before planting any field, before writing, before money, before almost everything we call civilization. Bread already existed, and here's the part that surprised archaeologists. Bread is older than agriculture. People were already making bread before they had farms to guarantee a supply of grain. Some researchers suggest it may have been the other way around from what we always imagined. The desire for that processed product, for the bread that the accidental paste produced, may have been what drove the first humans to cultivate deliberately. They didn't just want to survive. They wanted to make sure the grain never ran out. Maybe agriculture wasn't born from hunger. Maybe it was born from desire. Wheat entered this story and changed everything. Other grains existed, rye, barley, oats, but wheat had something none of the others possessed. Two proteins that, when mixed with water and worked by hand, formed gluten, an elastic network capable of trapping the gas bubbles produced during fermentation and letting the bread rise. No other grain does this as consistently. That is why wheat, and not barley, not rye, not oats, became the foundation of bread culture across the Mediterranean, the Near East, and eventually much of Europe and the Americas. And Egypt understood this before anyone else. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves, contrary to what was long believed. They were salaried workers, and a significant portion of their wages was paid in bread. Archaeologists excavated a complex of state bakeries on the Giza Plateau, capable of producing tens of thousands of loaves per day. They found ceramic molds stacked by the thousands and administrative records tracking grain inputs and bread outputs with the precision of a modern logistics operation. Without bread, the stones didn't rise. In ancient Egyptian, the word for bread and the word for life were the same. It was not a poetic coincidence. It was a literal description. And the Egyptian bakers were already doing something that the best bakers in the world still do today. They saved a piece of the previous day's dough to start the next batch. They didn't know yeast was a living organism, but observation had taught them that keeping that piece produced reliable rise, while starting from scratch was unpredictable. The technique contained knowledge of microbiology without needing the theory. 4,500 years ago. The class marker that would survive for 3,000 years appeared early. White bread for the rich, dark bread for the poor. The difference was practical before it was symbolic. In Rome, the Latin word for the finest white flour was siligo, and it appeared in texts about elite consumption just as naturally as someone today might mention a wine from a specific vintage. A Roman who offered dark bread to guests was saying something about their economic situation that no explanation afterward could erase. In the Middle Ages, the dark, dense loaf was sturdy enough to use as a plate. A thick slab of hard bread called a trencher served as a vessel for meats and vegetables. The bread absorbed the cooking juices and was afterward consumed by the servant or given to the poor. The plate was the bread. Rome understood the political dimension of this with a clarity few civilizations matched afterward. The free distribution of bread across the Roman Empire was not generosity. It was political infrastructure. An emperor unable to maintain the supply faced riots that no military force could easily contain. The expression, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, describes the mechanism precisely. Feed the city, entertain the city, and the city won't overthrow you. Fail at either one, and the calculation changes fast. In England, in 1267, a law fixed the price, weight, and quality of bread sold in markets in direct relation to the current price of wheat. Bakers who repeatedly sold underweight loaves were dragged through the streets with the defective bread tied around their necks. It wasn't punishment for commercial fraud, it was punishment for social threat. For most of the medieval population, bread was the narrow line between subsistence and starvation. A bad harvest raised the price of wheat. Expensive wheat raised the price of bread. Expensive bread cut the diet of poor households below what was needed to keep working. The chain was simple: weather, wheat, bread, labor, social stability. That is why regulating bread was a government function, not a market one. Markets find equilibrium. Starvation is not equilibrium. Starvation is the end of the market. Bread riots were one of the most frequent forms of popular uprising in pre-industrial Europe, more common than many political rebellions. A monarch could lose a distant war and keep the throne, but if the price of bread rose for several weeks, protests stopped being a possibility and became a countdown. The math was straightforward. In many early modern European cities, a working family could spend more than half its income on bread. In bad harvest years, that proportion approached 3/4. There was no room to absorb a price increase. Buying a more expensive loaf meant cutting food, falling behind on rent, or selling a tool needed for work. The price hike didn't affect a consumer preference. It directly attacked the ability to stay alive. The most famous episode happened in France. In the years before the Revolution of 1789, the price of bread rose while wages stagnated. A series of bad harvests and severe winters turned the daily loaf into a national crisis. For a Parisian worker, bread could absorb up to 80% of their income. The debates about political representation and aristocratic privilege were important, but they unfolded against the material backdrop of a much more immediate question. Will there be bread tomorrow? The Women's March on Versailles in October 1789 began in the markets of Paris. Thousands of women, many of them responsible for feeding their families, marched through the rain to the royal palace to demand bread and forced King Louis XVIII to return to the capital. The French Revolution is usually remembered through declarations of rights, speeches, and guillotines. But one of its decisive moments was a crowd that wasn't asking for a political theory. It was asking for flour. Napoleon understood the lesson. His armies depended on mobile bread-making systems, field ovens, and supply chains capable of turning grain into rations while the troops advanced. Battles were won with artillery. Campaigns were won with flour. The technology that reversed bread's social hierarchy arrived in the second half of the 19th century: the steel roller mill. Traditional stones ground grain between two flat surfaces, breaking bran and germ and distributing them unevenly through the flour. Separating truly white flour required multiple grindings and siftings, a process so costly that the finest flour remained a luxury product. The roller mills introduced commercially in the 1870s and 1880s cleanly separated the three components of the wheat kernel and did it at a radically lower cost. By 1900, white flour was affordable enough that working-class families in Europe and North America who had eaten dark bread out of economic necessity could now buy it. The change was fast. And for those who lived through it, it was unambiguously good. Nobody mourned the disappearance of dark bread. It was associated with poverty, limitation, and lack of choice. Working families who had eaten dark bread for generations switched to white in less than a decade once it became affordable. The old loaf vanished without ceremony. What had been lost only became clear later. Most of the fiber, B vitamins, minerals, and complex aromatic compounds in wheat were concentrated in the bran and germ, exactly the parts the roller mill was designed to remove. In the early 20th century, Pellagra and Beriberi, deficiency diseases linked to the absence of vitamins found in whole grains, became serious public health problems among populations that had just adopted diets based on refined grains. The solution was enrichment, adding synthetic vitamins back to white flour from which the natural vitamins had just been removed. The practice is still standard today. White bread from any modern supermarket is enriched with iron, folic acid, and several B vitamins because the milling process eliminated them first. Enrichment returns roughly what the industry took out, but in a form that doesn't always behave the same way inside a complex biological system. The experiment has been running for a century. The results are still being interpreted. In 1961, a British Baking Research Association developed the process that would transform bread more deeply than any technology since the roller mill, the Chorleywood bread process. The system uses high-speed mechanical mixing, roughly 10 times faster than traditional methods, to develop gluten structure in a fraction of the time fermentation would require. A loaf that once needed 24 hours was now ready in 3.5, from mixing to oven. Today, this process produces approximately 80% of the bread sold in the United Kingdom. Most people who have eaten British bread in recent decades have tasted it without ever knowing the name. The process made bread faster, cheaper, and more uniform. It also allowed the use of lower quality wheat that doesn't work with traditional techniques. Industrial bread doesn't need strong wheat. It needs additives. A typical industrial loaf contains ascorbic acid, emulsifiers, soy flour, and vegetable oil. A Chorleywood loaf can stay soft for a week. A naturally fermented sourdough starts going stale in 2 or 3 days. In the United States, Otto Frederick Rohvetter invented pre-sliced bread in 1928. Wonder Bread adopted the technology immediately. In less than a decade, sliced bread became the default domestic format for a large portion of the American population. The expression, "the greatest thing since sliced bread," reflects the genuine enthusiasm with which consumers received something that was above all convenient. Uniform slices, soft texture, long shelf life, no knife required. Almost nobody asked what had to be done to the bread to achieve it. The big difference between industrial bread and naturally fermented bread isn't only in the ingredient list. It's in something that rarely appears on the label: time. For industry, time is a cost. For fermentation, it is an ingredient. When dough rests for many hours, it isn't simply waiting. Inside, a succession of chemical and biological processes is happening. Yeasts consume sugars and produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. Lactic acid bacteria generate organic acids. Enzymes in the flour break large molecules into smaller components. Flavor is not added from the outside. It is built slowly from within the dough. A slow fermentation produces dozens, sometimes hundreds of aromatic molecules. Some recall nuts, butter, yogurt, toasted grain, ripe fruit, damp earth after rain. Those large holes that some people read as a defect are the visible trace of a prolonged fermentation and a gluten network capable of holding gases for hours. The shape tells the story of the process. Time also changes how the body receives the bread. During a long fermentation, bacteria and enzymes can reduce compounds that interfere with mineral absorption and may slow the rise in blood sugar that follows eating. A loaf fermented for 48 hours is not chemically identical to one made in 3. The food industry didn't destroy bread. It solved real problems. It allowed enormous cities to be fed with a cheap, safe, and consistent product. The convenience wasn't a conspiracy. It was an effective response to urbanization and the transformation of domestic life. The problem arose when the industrial solution stopped presenting itself as one form of bread and started appearing as the definition of bread. For several generations, millions of people grew up believing that a loaf should be soft, white, uniform, slightly sweet, and last a week. When naturally fermented bread reappeared, it didn't seem old. It seemed new. Tradition came back disguised as innovation. The sourdough revival that started in San Francisco in the 1980s and accelerated globally after 2010 is, on the surface, a story about artisan culture and middle-class preferences. Beneath the surface, it is a story about what industrial bread eliminated and about how much some people are willing to pay to get it back. The live starter in a contemporary bakery is a culture of wild yeasts and bacteria maintained through continuous feeding. It is exactly the same principle used by the Egyptian bakers of Giza 4,500 years ago. The revival isn't about inventing something new. It's about recovering a very old technique abandoned in pursuit of speed. Whoever pays $15 for a sourdough boule is paying for 48 hours of process, for the work of a baker who woke in the middle of the night, and for a technique that demands judgment, not just a machine mixing at high speed. Whether that difference justifies a price 15 times higher belongs to the realm of personal values. But the difference exists, and it can be measured. There is a pattern that runs through all of food history. The food of the rich becomes mass food when technology makes it cheap. The food of the masses becomes the food of the rich when scarcity, craft, or time make it expensive again. Spices followed that arc. Sugar did too. Coffee did too. White bread followed it, and then was caught by its own inversion. What changes is not necessarily the food. It's the context of its production, who makes it, how long it takes, what gets added, what gets removed, and what the person choosing it is trying to say about themselves. The wheat is the same, the yeast is the same, the water is the same. The difference between an industrial sandwich loaf and a 48-hour sourdough is a difference of time, attention, and process. And that difference costs $13. A loaf of bread is probably the oldest manufactured food product in human history. It predates writing. It predates money. It predates most of the institutions and technologies we associate with civilization. Bread was born from a mistake, grew with empires, fed the workers of the pyramids, started revolutions, sustained armies, regulated cities, was transformed by industry, stripped of nutrition, artificially enriched, compressed by machines, and now ferments slowly again in bakeries that charge a luxury price for a practice that existed before any luxury was ever invented. It never knew any of this. The weight is ours. And we have always used it to say something about ourselves that goes far beyond what we are eating. So the next time you pick up a loaf of bread, whether the $2 bag at the grocery store or the $15 round at the bakery with the name written in chalk on the board, know that you're not just choosing a food. You are taking part in a conversation that is 14,000 years old, and it isn't over yet.